A Boeing 747 flies at 35,000 feet. That's nearly 7 miles above the Earth. Space begins at 62 miles up. That's only 9 times higher than where you're sitting right now on your next flight. 9 times. That sounds almost doable, right? So here's the question nobody asks. Why can't a passenger plane just keep climbing? The answer involves physics so brutal, so unforgiving, that by the end of this video, you'll look at every plane you ever see and think, I had no idea how close to the edge that thing actually is. Let's start with what a commercial plane actually is. A fully loaded Boeing 747 weighs 412 metric tons at takeoff. That's roughly the same as 60 adult elephants, or a 7-story building, hurling itself through the air at 570 miles per hour. And it does this burning through about 4 liters of jet fuel every single second. Every second. Now here's where your brain should start to glitch. That thing, that flying skyscraper, is already operating at the absolute edge of what's physically possible for an aircraft. It's not being held back. It's not playing it safe. It is maxed out. And that is exactly why it can't go to space. To understand this, you need to go back to one single moment in 1947. Chuck Yeager, a former World War II fighter pilot with absolutely zero fear, climbed into a rocket-powered aircraft called the Bell X-1 and broke the sound barrier for the first time in history. Nobody knew if a plane could survive it. The controls shook violently. The aircraft nearly tore itself apart. But he made it through, and after that, engineers got greedy. They thought, if we can break the sound barrier, what else can we break? So in the 1960s, NASA built the X-15, a rocket plane that flew to the edge of space. It hit Mach 6.7, that's 4,520 miles per hour, and climbed to 67 miles above Earth. Some of those pilots were even awarded astronaut wings. But here's the thing nobody talks about. The X-15 was not a plane in any way you'd recognize. It had no jet engines. It had no wings designed for lift. It was essentially a missile with a human inside. And that distinction between a plane and a spacecraft is exactly where our story gets interesting. Here's everything you need to understand how flight works. 4 forces. Lift pushes the plane up. Gravity pulls it down. Thrust pushes it forward. Drag slows it down. A plane flies when lift beats gravity and thrust beats drag. Simple, beautiful, elegant. But here's the brutal truth hiding inside that simplicity. Every single one of those forces depends on one thing: air, and space has none. Let's start with lift, because this is where the plane's fate is sealed. Picture a wing from the side. It's not flat. It's curved on top and flatter on the bottom. When air rushes over it, the air on top has to travel faster to keep up. Faster air means lower pressure on top, higher pressure on the bottom. And that difference pushes the wing upward. That's lift. But here's what's critical. Lift only works if there's enough air to push against. As a plane climbs higher, the air gets thinner, fewer air molecules, less pressure difference, less lift. At 35,000 feet, where your typical flight cruises, the air is already 25% as dense as it is at sea level. The plane is working hard just to maintain altitude there. But here's the interesting part. To compensate for thin air, a plane can go faster. Speed creates more airflow over the wing, which generates more lift even in thin air. So why not just go faster and higher? Because of the engines. A jet engine works like this. Imagine a giant fan sucking in air, squeezing it tight, mixing it with fuel, lighting it on fire, and blasting it out the back. That explosion pushes the plane forward. But notice what it needs first. Air. Lots and lots of air. A single jet engine on a 747 swallows 1.2 tons of air every second at takeoff. Now start climbing. At 60,000 feet, not even close to space, the air is so thin that a jet engine can barely sustain combustion. The fuel has almost nothing to mix with. It's like trying to light a campfire in a vacuum. The engines don't just lose power gradually. They flame out. They die. This is why commercial aircraft have a ceiling, typically around 43,000 feet. Push above that, and you're not flying anymore. You're falling with style. There's a zone pilots call the coffin corner. At extreme altitude, a plane faces two deadly speed limits simultaneously. Go too slow, and the wings can't generate enough lift in the thin air. The plane stalls and drops. Go too fast, and the airflow over the wings goes supersonic, creating shock waves that tear the plane apart. The gap between those two speeds, the safe flying window, gets narrower and narrower as you climb. Higher, at 60,000 feet, on some aircraft, that margin is just 10 to 20 knots wide. 10 knots. On a plane doing 500 miles per hour. That's the difference between flying and dying, and it's the reason passenger planes can't just keep climbing. But that's not even the biggest problem. Even if we solve the engine issue, even if we solve the lift issue, there's a third wall, and it's made of physics itself. Speed. Space isn't just up. That's the misconception that changes everything. Getting to space isn't about altitude, it's about speed. To stay in orbit around Earth, you don't just need to reach 62 miles up. You need to be traveling sideways at 17,500 miles per hour. That's Mach 23. Let that sink in. Your 747 cruises at Mach 0.85. To reach orbit, it would need to go 27 times faster. And this is where the physics becomes merciless. As you approach those speeds in the atmosphere, air resistance doesn't just slow you down, it melts you. The friction generates temperatures above 1,600 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to vaporize aluminum, hot enough to glow orange from the ground. This is exactly what happens to the space shuttle during re-entry. It's literally on fire. And it had a specially engineered heat shield just to survive it. A commercial plane's aluminum body would be soup long before it got anywhere near orbital speed. The Concorde, the supersonic passenger jet, flew at 60,000 feet in Mach 2. That's twice the speed of sound. Passengers could see the curvature of the Earth, and the sky above them was a deep, dark blue, almost space-like. But even the Concorde was still operating on the same basic principles. It still needed air. It was still nowhere near orbital speed. It was still fundamentally a plane. The sky looked like space. The physics said otherwise. The SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest jet ever built, could hit Mach 3.3 and cruise above 80,000 feet. At those speeds, the aircraft's titanium skin heated to over 300 degrees Celsius just from air friction. Engineers had to design it so the panels fit loosely on the ground, because the plane only reached its proper shape when it expanded in the heat of flight. At rest, the SR-71 literally leaked fuel from gaps in its own body. That's how extreme the physics got, and that was still only Mach 3. Orbital velocity is Mach 23. Here's the real gut punch. A 747 carries about 220,000 liters of jet fuel for a long-haul flight. The space shuttle's external tank, just the big orange fuel tank bolted to the outside, held 2.05 million liters of propellant, 9 times more fuel for a vehicle that weighed less than a 747. And most of that fuel was burned in the first 8 minutes of flight. To get to space, you don't need a bigger plane. You need a fundamentally different machine, one that carries its own oxygen, generates its own combustion, and is essentially a controlled explosion pointed at the sky. So here's the simple truth, wrapped up clean. A passenger plane can't go to space because it's a creature of the atmosphere. Everything about it, the wings, the engines, the structure, is designed to work with air. Remove the air, and it's not a plane anymore. It's just a very expensive rock. Space doesn't care about lift. Space doesn't care about jet engines. Space doesn't care about aerodynamics at all. To get there, you need to stop flying and start exploding in a very precise, very controlled direction. And when you think about it, that 747 sitting on the runway is actually something almost miraculous. It takes 400 people, their luggage, and enough fuel to fill a swimming pool, and makes it float through the sky at 35,000 feet. Not by overpowering nature, but by understanding it right down to the last molecule of air. It just knows where its world ends. And honestly, so should we.